If you've been searching for how to invest in SpaceX using Webull, there's something important you need to understand right from the start, because this is where most people get confused and honestly where a lot of misleading videos begin. You cannot directly buy SpaceX stock on Webull, and the reason isn't a limitation of your account or your region, it's simply because SpaceX is still a private company. That means it is not listed on any public stock exchange, like the NYSE or Nasdaq, and because of that, there is no ticker symbol for it on Webull, Robinhood, Fidelity, or any other normal retail brokerage. But that doesn't mean the story ends there. In fact, once you understand how private companies work, you'll start to see the actual pathways that investors use, and more importantly, what is realistic versus what is just hype on social media. So let's break this down in a way that feels real, practical, and actually useful if your goal is to get exposure to SpaceX or companies like it. First, imagine what Webull actually is doing behind the scenes. When you open the app, you're seeing a marketplace of public companies. These are businesses that have gone through an IPO, meaning they have sold shares to the public and are now traded freely on exchanges. So when you search for something like Apple or Tesla or Amazon, Webull can instantly show you the stock because those companies have already gone through that public listing process. But when you type SpaceX into Webull, nothing shows up. Not because it's hidden, not because you need a special account, but because there is literally no public stock to trade. SpaceX shares exist, but they are held privately by founders, early employees, venture capital firms, and a small group of accredited investors. Now here's where things get interesting. Even though you can't buy SpaceX directly, investors still try to get indirect exposure. And this is where most real strategies begin. The first and most common method is understanding what you actually want when you say invest in SpaceX. Most people don't literally mean owning SpaceX shares. What they usually mean is they want exposure to the growth of space exploration, satellite internet, rocket launches, and Elon Musk's broader ecosystem. That distinction matters because once you reframe it, suddenly there are actually accessible options inside Webull. For example, you can invest in companies that are connected to the same industry. Think about aerospace suppliers, satellite technology firms, defense contractors, and even ETFs that bundle multiple space-related companies together. These are publicly traded, meaning Webull can actually give you access to them. So instead of trying to force access to a private company, you're building exposure through related sectors. This is a very common strategy used by both retail investors and professionals when a high-profile company is still private. Now let's talk about a more advanced route that people often hear about online, which is pre-IPO investing. This is where things start sounding exciting, but also where you need to be careful. There are private market platforms that sometimes allow accredited investors to buy shares in private companies like SpaceX before they go public. These shares usually come from early employees or existing investors who want to cash out some of their equity. However, this is not something Webull directly supports. Webull is not a private equity marketplace. It is strictly focused on public securities. So if someone tells you that you can just switch a setting or enable SpaceX stock on Webull, that is not accurate. What actually happens in the real world is that private share trading occurs on separate platforms, often with strict requirements, high minimum investments, and limited access only to qualified investors. Even then, pricing is not always transparent, and liquidity is very low compared to public markets. Another important reality is that even if you somehow gain access to private SpaceX shares, you cannot freely trade them like normal stocks. You might have to hold them for years, and selling them depends on finding a willing buyer in a private transaction. So it's a very different experience from what people expect when they hear investing in stocks. Now let's bring it back to something practical inside Webull itself, because most viewers are trying to figure out what they can actually do today, not just theory. Inside Webull, you can build what is called thematic exposure. That means instead of investing in SpaceX directly, you invest in the broader innovation wave that SpaceX is part of. This includes aerospace manufacturing, satellite communications, reusable rocket technology, and even companies involved in defense contracts or GPS infrastructure. You might also see ETFs that track space exploration themes. These funds typically hold a basket of companies working in related fields. While they won't perfectly mirror SpaceX performance, they give you exposure to the same industry trends, such as increasing satellite deployment, commercial space travel, and government space contracts. Now, let's address something that many people wonder about but rarely get a clear answer to. Will SpaceX ever go public? The truth is, no one outside the company can answer that with certainty. Elon Musk has publicly stated multiple times that an IPO is not likely in the near term, especially because SpaceX relies heavily on long-term engineering projects like Starship development and Starlink satellite expansion. Public markets often demand short-term financial performance, while SpaceX operates more like a long-term infrastructure and research company. So even though an IPO is theoretically possible in the future, it is not something you should base your investment decisions on right now. Now imagine you're sitting inside Webull trying to find SpaceX. You search, nothing appears, and you might feel like you're missing something. But in reality, the platform is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It is showing you all publicly available stocks, and SpaceX simply isn't one of them. At this point, a smart investor shifts focus from trying to force access to one company and instead builds a strategy around sectors, trends, and related technologies. Let's talk briefly about what makes SpaceX so unique in the first place, because understanding that helps you understand why direct investment is not available. SpaceX is not just a rocket company. It is a vertically integrated aerospace manufacturer. That means it designs, builds, and launches its own rockets, and also operates its own satellite network through Starlink. Very few companies in the world operate at that level of control across the entire supply chain. Because of that structure, its valuation is heavily influenced by private funding rounds, rather than public market trading. That's why its price per share is not visible on Webull or any stock chart app you might normally use. Now, if your goal is still to position yourself early in something similar to SpaceX growth, the key idea is patience and positioning rather than chasing direct ownership. Many investors who missed early tech giants like Amazon or Tesla focus now on emerging aerospace and satellite industries instead of waiting for a single company to become available. Inside Webull, you would typically start by using the search function, not for SpaceX itself, but for aerospace, space exploration, satellite communications, or defense technology. What you are doing is letting the platform show you what is publicly investable in that space. Then you evaluate companies based on fundamentals like revenue growth, government contracts, innovation pipelines, and exposure to space-related infrastructure. This is where investing becomes more about strategy than hype. Another thing worth mentioning is risk awareness. Anytime you see ads or social media posts claiming that you can buy SpaceX stock through Webull or through some hidden method, you should treat that very carefully. The financial world has a lot of misinformation, especially around high-profile private companies. If a platform is not officially listing a stock, it's usually because it legally cannot. So the realistic takeaway is simple. Webull is a powerful tool for investing in public markets, but it does not give access to private companies like SpaceX. Your real options are indirect exposure through public companies and ETFs, or waiting for a potential IPO in the future, which is uncertain in both timing and structure. If you understand that clearly, you're already ahead of most beginners who assume all big companies are tradable at all times. And here's the mindset shift that actually matters. Investing is not about chasing a single company at any cost. It's about identifying long-term trends and positioning yourself where innovation is heading. SpaceX represents space commercialization, satellite internet expansion, and reusable rocket technology. Those themes already exist in public markets, even if the company itself does not. So when you open Webull, you are not missing SpaceX. You are actually looking at the broader ecosystem that SpaceX is helping to shape. And once you start thinking that way, investing becomes less about finding a hidden button or secret listing, and more about understanding how industries evolve, how companies connect, and how you can participate in that growth using the tools that are actually available to you right now.